Hi, my name's Beth, I'm principal of Merge Architects. Thanks for having me. Love housing. I'm so relieved, Brian, that I'm not the only one up here not talking directly about affordable housing, because I got super nervous when David invited me. I'm like, I'm not really doing the HUD, in all caps, kind of housing, but what we are doing at Merge, and I've got my, looking at the clock too, is we are building housing for incredibly low prices per foot. So that, in theory, we're also building them in neighborhoods that are not that pricey. Although I'm proud to report that all of our housing projects are creating records for high sales per foot. So I believe good design sells. I know Larry last night was talking about how he has these pro forma sheets that he compares with all of his projects. And then the naysayer developers say, well, that's going to cost a lot of money. And he talks about how much more they make and the comps they got for the last project. So we're not as seasoned, or we haven't been around as long as Brooks Scarpa, but we are starting to also have our own short list of each housing project that has been a success in that way. So a little bit about Merge. And I'm bringing up the rear here, really talking about design. I don't have these altruistic stories of these amazing stories of Jackson and Kansas City. We are living in a city, Boston, forgot to say that, that is in a way a very sophisticated city, and ironically one of the hardest places to build good contemporary work. There are so many things standing in the way. There are a lot of well-intended folks there, and there's a lot of money there. And we're booming. Mayor Walsh wants 53 new housing units by 2030, and yet we are a city of 9-unit projects. And the reason is 10 or more per the city zoning code forces the developer to include 13% affordable units. So I'm kind of talking about it in a slightly different way, and the problem with that is, unless you're doing 20 units and you have the site to do 20, it doesn't make sense to do more than 9. So we have this kind of small scale yet tight site density going on in the city, which I find very interesting. So a little bit about Merge. We're definitely based in Boston. We have a satellite office in Detroit. We're starting to build out a few blocks of housing in Detroit, which is really exciting. We're doing work in Iowa. We're doing some housing in Jackson, Wyoming. And we've also done a little bit of work in Panama and some schematic work for a city in Southeast China. So it's a little random, but we're starting to get out. My office is in an area called the Seaport, or 4-Point Channel, if you guys know Boston, which is a area of the city that has grown exponentially in the last just 3 or 4 years. But yet, this is the fabric of Boston that many people know and love, with all due respect. I do too, but that's not the kind of work that we do or that we're interested in, and it's also not the appropriate aesthetic and stylistic for a lot of these neighborhoods. So it's either the brick and the heavy layered detailing of the facade, or it's the classic triple decker, which is something we end up building up against more often. But what we're really into is, just to kind of take it outside of housing, is a little bit of just good old-fashioned craft in a way, thinking about it as assembly, putting things together. We also make, David, that's so cool that you have a steel shop, wow. We could barely fit enough desks in our office. We don't have that kind of space or capacity, but at Merge we are actually building a lot of the pieces on our project, and the way we're doing it is we're asking the GCs to, let us borrow their boom for the day so we can build this piece or that piece. And it's a way for us to be super hands-on, but also a way to maybe build something for $25K that the GC was pricing out at $200K. So it's a combination of traditional construction and general contractors and us kind of getting in there and making it work. The kind of thing that I'm fascinated by is what can we do with this? This is an art piece by Tadashi Kawamata called Chairs for Abu Dhabi. There's nothing remarkable about the pieces, but I think the space and the artifact at the end is actually quite remarkable. We have like many small offices in the beginning had to make do and make things and out of nothing. And so I really appreciate this kind of work. I know this isn't architecture in a classical sense, but it is very architectural and very spatial. And so one thing that I think is just what we should always talk about in architecture, whether it's housing or you know, a museum or a chair, is the core project. So it wasn't just a conceptual means for us, an economic means, but it is a way of finding where's the project in the project. And so what we did in these early projects, this was a restaurant, and the project really was this wall made out of cotton straps and plumbing pipe. This is a loft where we put over 40,000 dowels into a CNC cut pegboard to create this surface. And we physically made these projects, which is why I wanted to show these early pieces, to create texture. So we're really interested in the art of architecture and the art of the artifact. And then fabrication, I would say we're more of a low-tech, high-touch kind of practice, where we are obviously CNCing, but we're not, we're using very simple means, very simple materials, and very inexpensive materials. And we're actually fabricating and making and installing these pieces. This is a orthodontist clinic where the GC built out the whole space, but we did these CNC cut ribs, and our office actually fabricated this polycarb wall to create this glowing double height space within the back of this program. So that's just a little bit about craft. The next thing I'm super interested in is the social ecology, so to speak, of architecture and how people use space, which is where housing comes in, like how people live together, like living room to bedroom. You guys really set it up so well with all of your plan explorations about the living room, the core, with Brian. And so how people live within a tight unit within the city, but also how those dwellings live within the block. And because we've been working on some pretty small scale, 9 unit and less. In Detroit, we're doing 100 units, but in Boston, 9 units or less so far. We really have to grapple with this. And because every developer wants to build as much as they can, square footage wise, we have to really game the zoning code. And we really have to pack in 9 units when maybe it really can only fit 6. And then there are often these crazy parking requirements which seem to make the project impossible. So Boston is tight, Boston is dense, it's very different from Jackson or Kansas City, much like I would say Philly. And you know, these 11-foot wide leftover sites are fascinating to me. We haven't quite been that extreme, but I would love to have that opportunity. But they always feel crazy tight to us, regardless, even if they're wider. And they become like 11-foot sites because we need to pack 9 units into, let's say, 40 feet. This project that I want to talk about, this was done a few years ago in East Boston. And so, let's see if this works. No. Oh, there we go. So East Boston is this entire area here, right on the water. Boston proper is over here on the left. And the Seaport District that I showed you where my office is right down here. So the whole city is booming. Back Bay, Beacon Hill, that's all to the left of the screen. But East Boston has been this deep-rooted generations of Italians, Hispanic, Portuguese families, and in the past, I would say 5 years, is on fire in terms of development. In fact, my developer clients are having trouble even finding an affordable site, and yet it's still, by definition, a bit gritty. But it has the best views in the city because, as you can see, most of them are right close to the water, and it looks across to the skyline of downtown Boston. So a ton of potential. And we were lucky to get this site a few years ago, which is in the yellow, which is right next to an active shipyard. Sorry. Which is an active shipyard. It's partly active for the shipyard program use, but it also has like a really interesting arts community where they're building these incredible giant sculptural pieces, which I'll show you in a minute. And then there's a cool cafe there, which is kind of hip. So it has this vibe of this innovative place and space and maker culture. And then here we got this choice little site, which conveniently is right adjacent to the edge of the shipyard. There's a chain link fence here that separates the shipyard from our site in the so-called neighborhood, which is called Jeffrey's Point, and flanked by the classic triple decker. So I just want to pause here for a minute. I'll show you this aerial. Boston is, I have never done an as-of-right project. I don't even know what that looks like. Every single housing project we do has at least 8 to 15 variances that we have to ask for, which is crazy. And it's because most of them, not to get too in the weeds, have an FAR, floor area ratio of 1. That means that if you have a 2,000 square foot site, you can only build 2,000 square feet of square footage to sell. And really you need often twice that, or 3 times, and sometimes even more. So 1 variance means that you have to go in front of the whole neighborhood process, which is meeting after meeting after meeting, and the city process with the Zoning Board of Appeals, and the Boston Redevelopment Authority's design review, if you're lucky enough to get approved by the Zoning Board of Appeals. So to build 9 units, or even 4, could take 8 months to even get out of the gate. So it is very political, very time-consuming, and you have to build a narrative around your project. And the crazy thing is, there is so much, as with any city in the US, I think, mediocrity in terms of housing design, not in this room, but there is in Boston. And so what we're seeing is just this sea of hardy board, super taut facade projects because they're cheap. And the kind of ugly / mediocre at best projects are kind of sailing through the system because they're sort of familiar. So if you're ever trying to do something that you feel is exceptional or trying to push design, it takes longer. So that's what we've been up against in this neighborhood and every neighborhood, and they're very hostile. At the end of the day, the joy is winning them over at a bar, typically after the 8th meeting. Everybody's happy. You build in concessions that you can make, and so on. So it's complicated. But this site was super complicated. It's on this shipyard. Just a few shots of the context. Our site was over to the left. This is the shipyard. Gritty but cool. This is just one of the many, or 2, great pieces of sculpture. That's this giant siren octopus woman thing. Our site is right here, this big gap. And so there are a few of these super large, kind of call us Oldenburg type pieces. There's a big stoplight over here.
Are you inside the shipyard?
I'm inside the shipyard, yep. And this chain link right here, which is still here, it's been there forever, is the boundary line between the shipyard and the neighborhood. So our site is right here, right on the other side of the chain link. Yep, see the triple deckers. So just a few more shots. This is from our site, right out on the sidewalk, looking back to the shipyard. Isn't that cool cafe? It's now a slightly different cafe called K.O. Pies. And just case in point, they, this past year, have decided to put a satellite of the Institute of Contemporary Art, the Diller Skip video did, which is directly across the water, on this site in the shipyard. So it's becoming this hotspot. And we built our housing project there, I think, 4 years ago. And we like to think that it has something to do with this whole neighborhood getting a little more attention. We just finished our 2nd housing project right next to it, and we're going through final approvals for our 3rd on the same block, which is two houses down. So we're starting to take over the whole street with this scale of housing and this kind of style. So again, this is the site flanked by the shipyard construction, the big box warehouse and the triple deckers to the right, and then the site. So the challenging thing was our client wanting to pack in 9 units, but we only had so much frontage. So we had to, what I really like about housing, which I think is relevant to all of our work here today, anybody doing housing, is how you actually puzzle these units together. And the tricky thing about the US is you need 2 means of egress most of the time. So how do you get 2 stairs in? economically, and these are all condos. So these are not affordable rentals, these are condos that we needed to build at the time for about $170 a foot, which is very low for Boston. All these projects I'm showing today are light frame. And the challenging thing with this project was that we needed light and air for the living spaces, yet we had to have bedrooms. They couldn't fit once you fit 9, which you can see a little better here. They're really skinny. I think they're about maybe 13 feet wide each, so there isn't room for a living room and a bedroom on the front facade, so we had to put them in the back. And so the crazy thing was, well, how do you have these floor through units and have a common corridor and 2 means of egress on each side? So we get into the kind of geeking out on these sections in housing, which is how do you game code, how do you pack in the 2 means of egress, and how do you get light and air to all the units. So the idea here was that we would skewer the units, the middle 4, with the common corridor, which meant that you were blocking off the back from the front of the unit. So what we ended up doing, which was a problem that became, I think, one of its greatest assets, was we went over and under the common corridor. The other thing, which is a theme, it seems, with Larry's work, and Brian mentioned it too, is how you sneak in another floor. So we were only allowed to build 3 floors. So from the front, which is the left, it looks like a 3-story building. But we snuck in a mezzanine floor in the middle of the section, which allowed us to go up and over the common corridor that needed to go cross-grain through the unit. So all these tricky kind of crazy things that you don't see from the street is something we're really interested in the work. So the way that it operated was what we would call level 0, which is the parking. The other thing politically was that as luck would have it, one of the neighbors, our direct abutter in the back, who was slightly elevated from us, thank goodness, worked on design review at the Boston Redevelopment Authority. So he had to technically recuse himself from the design review, but as a neighbor, he was at every meeting making sure we weren't going to block his view. So as of right, we could build 35 feet, but through negotiations, we were not allowed to build over 33 feet 6 inches, I think, or maybe it was 5 inches, because of him and because of what he sees in his kitchen window when he's drinking a cup of coffee at 8 o'clock in the morning, where I sat with him at least 3 times to see exactly what he would see. And we made that agreement, and he was out there measuring the framing until he got kicked off by my client at the site many, many times throughout construction. So it's crazy stuff that isn't written down. He ended up supporting the project because we came to these concessions, and we then had to sink the parking 3 feet, but we couldn't go any more than 3 feet because we were on the ocean and we would hit the water table. So we were literally like this. And of course we were right at the setbacks for the zoning side setbacks, minimum. And then we were at 0 lot line on the front and at the full allowable setback in the back. So on the ground floor, there are 2 entries, 2 stairs. As you go up, floor 1, the 2 means of egress are separated, but those become technically the front doors to those units because it's closer to the street. And then it's the 3rd floor where we have this common corridor that I showed you in section that allows you to check the box of the 2nd means of egress in the unit, and also to provide front doors for the top floor units, which is this floor through flats. If you build a 4-story building in Boston and you don't access the 4th floor from the interior of the unit and it becomes a public access point, you have to put an elevator in. So we avoided the cost of the elevator by accessing the 4th floor only from the 3rd floor, which is this floor. So I know this is tedious, but this is what we do. And we think it's cool that you can figure this stuff out, and we pack 9 units on the site. And then there are 4 private roof decks, which have this amazing view. This is a really quick little animation of what I just said, which is this tube typology of the unit. How do you stack them? At this time, within 35 feet, we had to come down a bit. Carve out, we had to have 1 parking space. Here we are packing the site, and we have to get 9 cars in there. So we carved out the ground level, and what I had just explained, we went down 3 feet for the parking, which allowed us to think of this more as a basement per code. and had one handicap unit on the ground level, which is the lower level. We cut the section. This was our problem. We have 3 stacked tubes, which in theory meant that the common corridor would have to go through one of the units, the middle unit. So we ended up doing that, which is of course going under and over. Everybody gets views out to the water. Bedrooms in the back, they still have light and air, but they don't have as good of a view, but it's okay. They have balconies in the middle units off the back. We tried to equal out all these super tall bedroom spaces. They're actually kind of amazing, even though they don't have the view, they're very tall. And then what we try to do at every project is really ramp up the green space. So parking, pockets for green, skewered common corridor. It's tricky. It's a puzzle. So we end up with this dumb box because we have to build it for $170 a foot, which might sound high in some parts of the U.S., but was extremely low in Boston at the time. And then we go back to the facade. So really, all we get at the end of the day as an artifact that you see in the city is often the facade. We don't typically get the side even. And so I wanted to show the early work to show you what we're really interested in, which is about making and fabricating, and what does that have to do with housing, but also this sense of social choreography and how you actually think about the dweller, the city inhabitant, and the streetscape. These aren't big buildings, so they're right there on the street. They're 15 feet up, they're 12 feet up, they're 30 feet up. And so they see the people passing by. And I think we didn't invent the balcony, but I think we are in love with the balcony and these little pockets of social space that we can grab from these projects that really change the streetscape. Because what's to the right of it were those taut triple deckers that have no depth whatsoever. So then we get into ideas about the facade and how we layer the facade and have these thresholds from the living room space to the streetscape. And so for this particular project, we were really thinking about the kind of crude but interesting language of the shipyard with the chain link. We weren't going to put specifically chain link on the building, but something that was reminiscent of this industrial palette. So we ended up looking at a stainless steel screen material mesh from Germany that we wrapped around these super frames. So we have very modest windows, Anderson windows, and then we have these very one-off custom super frames that we painted yellow so they're brighter. They actually bring light into the space when the sun is hitting them, and then these shapes around them that create this figural facade that at times feels kind of opaque on the oblique and then super transparent from head on. And so the way we sold it to the neighborhood was that it would become this green screen. They could grow on it at this sort of concrete hardscape corner of the city. It's finally starting to take a little bit. But same concept. We didn't build this. They wouldn't let us get on the boom and do this one. But we did find in a steel shop somebody who worked on ships and netting for fish traps. And he actually sewed this facade on to these triangular gusset plates. So again, very inexpensive. You see the layered space between the screen and the balcony and the super frame. And the parking below. It's not much. I think it was 4 feet wide, but it's sort of everything. And these spaces are beloved, and every time I'm there, even in the winter, there are people out on the decks, out on the balconies, a view of the sculpture. And so that problem with the corridor going through the cross grading through the units actually created the most dynamic units. These are 3 stories, and they're still level, and they feel very voluminous because they have 1.5 stories within the living room space. They have this catwalk condition that crosses over the gap, and the top floor and the lower floor are only 7.5 feet, which sounds awful, but because they open up to this double height space, it feels large and expansive, and of course has a great view of the water. Amazing view from the roof. And so we just completed, these are just some snapshots from a week ago. The building next door, we took down a triple decker. It's a double wide site with a small drive, and have now built, same concept of the tube, 6 more units, and it's the same idea with the frontage, which is to create this whole new typology along the street of these thick and thin moments on the facade that are 3-dimensional on the street and create these balconies. And this is our way of getting through the neighborhood process, as we have to still go through for each and every project, now on our 3rd. This is obviously steel slats, still getting back to our interest in fabrication. And then lastly, I know I just have a couple of minutes, how we are bringing our interest in concepts to Detroit. So we were hired by Bedrock Development a couple of years ago, and they're an amazing client. They actually bought blocks and blocks of parcels that look a lot like this, complete blank slate, other than these incredible historical mansions that were either abandoned or made into boarding houses or underused. And they were smart enough to hire not just one architecture firm, but 4, actually 5, including the historical architect, to build out these blocks of housing. So they needed to create this urban density overnight. Detroit is amazing. If you have a chance to go in the next few years, you should. It is booming, but it's like no other place I've ever been. It is incredibly dynamic. It's a complete maker culture, not just cars, but they have a lot of infrastructure and a lot of work and a lot of building and a lot of infill to go. So they hired an architect from the East Coast, which was us, the West Coast, which is Loha, Lorcan, O'Hurley that Larry mentioned last night from LA, Studio Dwell from Chicago, and HAA from Detroit to do some very contemporary housing. So we came in as a group, and we had these amazing schematic sessions with 60 people in the room to talk about what we thought was appropriate for this area. So the issue with Detroit is security, lack of density, lack of inventory, and then the pride and the neighborhoods that have stayed rallying around these old historical structures. So what we did is we tried to break it down in terms of what is beloved about these, other than the stylistics, but also this idea of the 3-dimensionality and the sculptural form of these historical structures. But how do we do that in a contemporary way? So our scope is this front right here, which we call the duplexes, which is along 1 street, and these white buildings that are not actually that white, called carriage homes that are within the blocks. And we have 6 blocks of those. The large corner buildings, the apartment buildings, are by Loha from LA, Lorcan O'Hurley. And then there's some townhouses mixed in from Studio Dwell, and then HAA has some of these larger projects throughout as well. So our scope was this, and what we're starting construction on in the last 6 weeks is this, are these blocks right here. So we're starting with one of these smaller blocks, which is about 11 units. So they vary from 9 to 11 units each. And so what I was interested in, and the office was interested in, is really looking at, and this has come up a lot, this theme of the courtyard. But for us, we wanted to somehow insert it into this tight, dense pressure footprint of the carriage home. So they're deep, they're windowless, except on the front and the back, and they're narrow. So what we did is we actually put in these very small private courtyards between 2 units. And so the dynamic is really interesting because you can't both share it for the problem with privacy, the lack of privacy that would imply. So each unit has access either by diffused light or translucent glass, or by transparent if they actually own the courtyard. And so what happens is one unit owns it and can access it and has transparent glass, and the unit on the left, in this case, or the right, on the left in the darker gray, has borrowed light from it with diffused light and translucent glass. And so it creates this pocket of light and air and circulation and ventilation within these tight footprinted spaces. And so it's a mix of 2- and 3-story units. We have 3 different types, A, B, C, and then each one has except for the B unit, has a 2- and 3-bedroom, 2- and 3-story version. How that courtyard plays out within the interior how it brings in all this light and air and this illusion of exterior space within the unit, which is very tight. And then what was really exciting for us, rather than the balcony, although these have balconies, was this roofscape. So you hear a lot about in architecture school, the fifth facade, but this really does matter on the site because you saw in one of those earlier slides these tall apartment buildings that look down onto our project. And because we are building these carriage homes technically within the block, like inside the block, so we wanted to create this exterior outdoor space on the roofscape, which is only 2 stories up. That would be part of the social life and network within the block itself. So we have these undulating roofs that slope up to create the 3rd bedroom and 3rd floor for the units that have it. And then the way that these decks oscillate back and forth between the units where they're somewhat private, somewhat public. You can still say hi to your neighbor, but you have a little bit of privacy. And then the kind of formal quality and landscape that creates from the apartment buildings on the corners. And so here's a view of all 6 blocks. And you can see the apartment buildings on the corner, and then here are the duplexes. And how that plays out on the streetscape. These are the alleys that shoot through the blocks. So these are the kind of somewhat private streets. So it's not it is vehicular for those that live there, but it's not a main thoroughfare. And so how we're trying to kind of texturize and textualize the facades of these with these balconies and more screening, translucence and opacity and so on with material palette. And that's how we sold it to the neighborhood. So they originally saw this and thought, whoa, this is really out of context with regard to the heritage homes that we have on the site and have had historically on the site. But we walked them through the way that we were thinking through the narrative of the materiality, and we were pulling out details. In this case, there are these clovers everywhere on these homes, and found a way to create a pattern out of this in the stainless steel mesh that could then be deployed throughout the facade, and they thought that was cool, so it worked. We're working with some brick, trying to bring the brick palette back into it from the heritage homes. And then lastly, the duplexes, which is just 2 blocks along one street, Edmund Place. What we were really trying to do, and this was more of the landscape architect for the master planning of the project. They have this amazing swath through the block called the Muse, which is going to be pedestrian accessed only. And it allows the block to be split up because it's super wide, allows for this great pedestrian passage, and then has a way of knitting together all of the properties and projects from all the architects throughout. So we wanted to have kind of a miniature version of that idea along Edmund Place. Rather than having this solid urban wall, we designed these to have these cuts that would have these puzzly keyhole spaces that you could filter in through the streetscape into the depth of the site. And so just a couple of views. They're about, they range from 9 feet to 12 feet-ish wide, so they're tight, but not so tight that they feel dangerous. They are the new entries for the unit. So there's the front stoop of some of the lower units, and then there's the stoop on the side through these passages of the back units. And so this was just a conceptual series of diagrams talking about how we thought of these. They're 2-story units stacked, and then they shift, and they have the front units and the back units that actually face the cityscape. And then finding ways of strategizing different opportunities to create these balcony spaces off of the shifting of the volumes and carves of the streetscape. And then really looking at these gap spaces of not just lower level entries, but also these stair towers that we needed to get up to the upper units, and how that would become part of the architecture and part of the experience of those gaps. And then parking, we had originally the master plan just had a sea of parking between the buildings, and so what we wanted to do was sort of glorify this idea of a carport and create this roofscape landscape for the upper level units to access from the back. So there are 2 different types that go into the block, the one I just described, and then another one called banded. So that was stacked. This is banded, and the banded is just a straight balcony condition off the street. And then what we did is we puzzled these together as this kind of collage of these housing types to create this varied streetscape that might actually come about over 30 years, but of course this needed to happen pretty much in 2. So we're trying to create the texture of a more kind of slowly forming, I would say, kind of randomly placed adjacency of city blocks that is often not a design strategy, but is how a city is actually formulated, which I think is kind of amazing. So we were trying to build that sort of logic into the block itself. So a view of the carport, the landscape. Again, the city blocks and the gaps between, and then how those green spaces are flanking the units. Oops. Okay, I'm going to stop there. So I think that we actually are starting to work on a HUD project for the first time in Greenwich, Connecticut, of all places. It's in the early stages, so it's too schematic to show. But what's fascinating to me is that the affordable housing, by definition, is more money per foot. We build these projects as open shop projects, so these are not union projects in the city of Boston. And so there's an economics that is a reality, but also it's a reality in terms of the zoning code and the fact that we have to find a way to build better housing in these 9 units and less properties. Thank you.